Okay, well, we're going to continue with Pope's essay on man, but let me just pause once again after our break to emphasize that not everybody was a rationalist, not everybody was a deist in the 18th century, but we tend to generalize about the period. Remember how I was talking about this last time, that there are certain kinds of qualities or movements that may come into dominance at a particular time. That does not mean that everybody thinks that way, or believes that way, or acts that way. But nevertheless, there may be certain things that are now dominant in the culture, sufficient for us to make certain kinds of cautious generalizations about the culture at that time. So, the Age of Reason. In the area of religion, since we've been talking about natural theology, I should very, very quickly point out that not only were there many religious believers, as I said earlier on, who were not deists and were not rationalists by any means, but this is also the time in England of a very great religious movement, Methodism, with the brothers Wesley, John and Charles Wesley, who took their congregations outdoors and had outdoor prayer meetings and all those glorious hymns. You know, one of the greatest periods of hymn composition was during that period. It was certainly in English, and you know, all of this was to emphasize a wholly different kind of religion than what Pope is talking about and what the deists were talking about. Something which would be much more a matter of emotion and imagination and intuition and what was believed to be faith than to emphasize reason in the way that Pope and others were doing. So, let's go on, however, with Pope, because this provides us with an insight to something that we otherwise don't often get. I mean, you've heard, as I said earlier, about deism, most of you, probably all of you, if you scratch your heads and think about it for a while, you know, in connection with American history and some of our principal founding fathers and founding mothers in the 18th century and the beginnings of the 19th century. But what is a deist? I mean, you may have heard some phrase or brief definition of it, but what does that really mean? Well, here in Pope, we actually have a text which shows us what this meant, or at least much of what it could mean. So, he now goes on, and I'm at the beginning of section 4, which is in line 113, an important passage. Go wiser thou, and in thy scale of sense, weigh thy opinion against providence. Does he really think that we should weigh our opinions against those of providence? Call imperfection what thou fanciest such. Say, here he gives too little, there too much. Destroy all creatures for thy sport or gust, yet cry, if man's unhappy, God's unjust. Okay, of course this is all ironic, isn't it? This is not how we are supposed to behave, according to Pope. If man alone engross not heaven's high care, alone made perfect here, immortal there, snatch from his hand the balance and the rod. Rejudge his justice, be the God of God. What is the balance? Anybody have an idea of what the balance is? Scale, right? That's what scales were always. You know, you've seen those images of scales of justice, right? You put whatever you want to weigh on one side, and then you put things that we know how much they weigh, weights on the other side, until they even out, and then you can make certain kinds of judgments, and that became very early on a metaphor for justice and for the evenness of justice. And of course, rod is the rod of authority. Snatch from his hand, from God's hand, the balance and the rod of authority. Rejudge God's justice, be the God of God. In pride, in reasoning pride, our error lies. All quit their sphere, right, in the great chain of being, and rush into the skies. Pride still is aiming at the blessed abodes. Men would be angels, angels would be gods, which of course is a nod in the direction of Milton, right? Aspiring to be gods, if angels fell, aspiring to be angels, men rebel. And who but wishes to invert the laws of order sins against the eternal cause? And so he goes on. Ask for what end the heavenly bodies shine. Earth, for whose use? Pride answers, but it's only pride that answers. 'Tis for mine, for me. Kind nature wakes her genial power, suckles each herb and spreads out every flower. Annual for me, the grape, the rose renew, the juice nectarious, and the balmy dew. For me, the mine 1,000 treasures brings. For me, health gushes from 1,000 springs. Seas roll to waft me, suns to light me rise. My footstool earth, my canopy the skies. See what he's saying? This is self-centeredness. This is self-centeredness, where we put ourselves in the center of the universe and then judge everything in terms of how it benefits or serves me. But errs not nature from this gracious end, from burning suns when livid deaths descend, when earthquakes swallow or when tempests sweep, towns to one grave, whole nations to the deep? No, 'tis replied, the first almighty cause acts not by partial, but by general laws, not by partial. Notice how he goes back again and again to that argument about the part in the whole. We only see the part. We don't see the whole. And the almighty cause acts not by partial, but by general laws. The exceptions few. Some change since all began, and what created perfect? Why then man? If the great end be human happiness, then nature deviates, and can man do less? As much that end a constant course requires of showers and sunshine, as of men's desires, as much eternal springs and cloudless skies, as men forever temperate, calm, and wise. If plagues or earthquakes break not heaven's design, why then a Borgia or a Catiline, two great criminals in history? You know, the Borgias were notorious in Renaissance Italy for, vicious kinds of criminal political activities. And Catiline, of course, is a very famous figure from ancient Rome who was denounced by Cicero in some famous orations. Who knows but he whose hand the lightning forms? See, who knows? Who can judge these things? What breaks heaven's designs? Who knows but he whose hand the lightning forms, who heaves old ocean, and who wings the storms, pours fierce ambition in a Caesar's mind, or turns young Ammon loose to scourge mankind. From pride, our very reasoning springs. Account for moral as for natural things. Why charge we heaven in these acquit? In both to reason, right is to submit. See what he's saying? Why do we agree with heaven in some respects and then disagree in others? On what basis do we do so? On what principle do we do so? In both, to reason right is to submit. See, what he's doing is very interesting. He's taking the whole notion of reason and he's establishing limits on reason, just as his best friend Jonathan Swift was going to do, as we are going to be getting to very soon. Better for us, perhaps it might appear, were there all harmony, all virtue here, that never air or ocean felt the wind, that never passion discomposed the mind, but all, that is to say universal order, subsists by elemental strife, and passions are the elements of life. The general order, since the whole began, is kept in nature and is kept in man. Okay? So notice the way in which his argument is moving towards now establishing certain limits on what reason can do. What would this man? Now upward will he soar, and little less than angel would be more. Now looking downwards, just as grieved appears, to want the strength of bulls, the fur of bears, made for his use all creatures, if he call, say what their use, had he the powers of all. Nature to these without profusion kind, the proper organs, proper powers assigned, each seeming want compensated, of course, here with degrees of swiftness, there of force, all in exact proportion to the state, nothing to add and nothing to abate. Each beast, each insect, happy in its own. See what he's been talking about? Each animal, each insect, each being on the planet is created according to what it ought to be. Is heaven unkind to man, and man alone? Shall be alone whom rational we call, be pleased with nothing if not blessed with all? I mean, is that what rationality is? That we are not going to be happy if we don't have everything the way we want it to be? The bliss of man, could pride that blessing find, is not to act or think beyond mankind. See, our proper happiness is not to think beyond mankind, what mankind is capable of thinking. No powers of body or of soul to share, but what his nature and his state can bear. Why has not man a microscopic eye? For this plain reason, man is not a fly. You see? I mean, why do you ask that we can't do certain kinds of things? Well, that's not what we are. It's not what we are. Say, what's the use? Were finer optics given to inspect a mite, not comprehend the heaven? Or touch, if tremblingly alive all o'er, to smart and agonize at every pore? I mean, what if our sense of touch were much more finely attuned? Well, it might be too much, right? Might be too much. Or quick effluvia darting through the brain, dye of a rose in aromatic pain. If nature thundered in his opening ears and stunned him with the music of the spheres, how would he wish what heaven had left him still, the whispering zephyr and the purling rill? Who finds not providence all good and wise, alike in what it gives and what denies? In other words, I mean, again and again and again, he says, like, well, what if our hearing were vastly enhanced? Well, could be too much, right? Could be really, really, really painful. And also, there would be certain delicate sounds that would no longer be delicate for us. In other words, what he's getting at by all of these analogies, these natural analogies, is that we are as we ought to be. So we should not criticize God for not making us different. Far as creation's ample range extends, the scale of sensual, mental powers ascends. Mark how it mounts to man's imperial race, from the green myriads to the peopled grass, what modes of sight betwixt each wide extreme, the mole's dim curtain and the lynx's beam, and so on and so on and so on. And he goes through all of these different qualities. And then he gets to section 8, where he talks about nature in the sense of external nature. See through this air, this ocean, and this earth. All matter quick in the sense of living. Have you ever heard the expression, the quick and the dead? The older meaning of the word quick was simply alive. All matter quick and bursting into birth, above how high progressive life may go, around, how wide, how deep extend below, and then look, vast chain of being, right? Vast chain of being. That's what we've been talking about all along. Which from God began, nature's ethereal, human, angel, man. Beast, bird, fish, insect, what no eye can see, even things that are smaller than any eye can see. No glass can reach, no glass in the sense of the glass in the microscope. From infinite to thee, from thee to nothing. On superior powers were we to press, inferior might press on ours. Or in the full creation leave a void where one step broken, the great scales destroyed. From nature's chain, whatever link you strike, 10th or 10,000th breaks the chain alike. Well, and if each system in gradation roll alike essential to the amazing whole, the least confusion but in one, not all, that system only, but the whole must fall. Let earth unbalanced from her orbit fly, planets and suns run lawless through the sky. Let ruling angels from their spheres be hurled, being on being wrecked and world on world, heaven's whole foundations to their center nod, and nature tremble to the throne of God. All this dread order break, for whom, for thee, vile worm, O madness, pride, impiety. Well, again and again and again, notice rhetorically, he hasn't added anything logically to the argument, but rhetorically, he keeps heaping up and heaping up and heaping up more and more instances of argument, analogies, and so forth to convince us of his case. So then we come to the conclusion here. This is in section 10, in 279 and following. Cease then, not order, imperfection, name. So you don't claim that you find imperfections in what is really order. Our proper bliss, our proper happiness, depends on what we blame, on what we call imperfection. Know thy own point. This kind, this due degree of blindness, weakness, heaven bestows on thee. Okay? Know your own place in the great scheme of things. This, by the way, is one of the most famous passages in English literature. Submit. Submit. Remember, he said this before. But notice he's building this up now to a high rhetorical point. Submit in this or any other sphere. Secure to be blessed, to secure to be as blessed as thou canst bear, safe in the hand of one disposing power, or in the natal or the mortal hour. Either in the natal hour, natal, birth, or in the mortal, death, hour. All nature is but art unknown to thee. Nature is all art in the sense that it is a creation. All nature is but art unknown to thee. All chance direction. See, everything that appears by chance, or appears to you to be chance, is really happening by direction, which thou canst not see. All discord, harmony not understood. Everything that you take to be discord is really part of a larger harmony that you do not understand. All partial evil, universal good. And spite of pride, in erring reason spite. Notice erring reason. One truth is clear: whatever is right. Whatever is right. And so this is the grand argument. How does he justify the ways of God to man? Well, based on the argument that, first of all, God is the creator of a universe which everywhere gives us evidence of order. And that order must have been designed by a divine orderer, and such a divine orderer must have created the best of all possible universes. And so when we complain, seeing only the part and not the whole, what we are doing then is making ourselves the God of God, judging the justice of God. And this is an instance of erring reason. Not that reason doesn't have a place, of course. This is the age of reason, after all. But to make such a kind of claim against God is an instance of erring reason. So finally, we are brought back full circle to his premise that whatever is right. And if whatever is right, then take a given instance of something that might seem on the face of it to be wrong, it must follow that this is nevertheless right, in some sense that we do not fully understand. Okay? So, then we come to the short verse paragraph that we have next in the anthology, which is from the next section. The next, it's called Epistle 2 here in the Essay on Man. Okay, this is the second famous passage from this work. The first famous passage from this work that is quoted all the time in cultural histories, literary histories, and so on, is the passage that I was just drawing your attention to, which begins in Epistle 1, lines 279 through 292, ending with whatever is right. And then the second very, very famous passage, which is quoted all over the place in people's books and articles on this era, is the one at the beginning of Epistle 2 that I'm about to go through with you. Know then thyself. Now that's an ancient dictum. Know thyself. Know thyself. Socrates was very much in favor of that sort of thinking. Know then thyself. But notice the second part of that sentence. Presume not God to scan. Okay? The proper study of mankind is man. Okay? We can only have limited knowledge of God here on earth, but we can learn a very great deal about human nature and about nature in general. This is the proper sphere for reason. Based on this isthmus of a middle state. What's an isthmus? Surely somebody here knows what's an isthmus.
It's like a little strip of land that goes through a body of water, separating two bodies of water.
Okay, what's an example? Can you think of an example in our hemisphere? Yeah,
Central America.
Yeah, right. Central America, especially where it gets most narrow in the area of Panama, but Central America generally, yeah. That's an isthmus. It's different from a peninsula. Florida, for example, is a peninsula. Okay, but an isthmus is a relatively narrow neck of land between two bodies of water. Okay, so how does this apply metaphorically here? We are placed on this isthmus of a middle state. You see, here we are in the middle of the great scale of being, or great chain of being, okay? Between one whole range of the scale in one direction and another whole range of the scale in another direction. A being darkly wise and rudely great, okay? These are oxymorons. Remember we talked about oxymorons before when we were talking about Elizabethan poetry. An oxymoron is a seeming contradiction in poetry. It's a poetic term for a seeming contradiction. A being darkly wise, okay? We usually think of wisdom as light, don't we? But here is a being darkly wise and rudely great. Rude used to have another connotation than it does now. It used to mean somebody of low station. Somebody of low station. It was more or less equivalent to the word rustic. With too much knowledge for the skeptic side. I mean, you can't just be a universal skeptic because there's too much that we are capable of knowing to be universally skeptical. With too much, too much knowledge for the skeptic side, with too much weakness for the Stoic's pride. The Stoic who thought that reason could be enthroned in ancient philosophy, and that we could know more than we actually can know. He, that is to say, man, human beings, hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast. You see, because we're in the middle. In doubt his mind or body to prefer. Okay? I mean, we, in a dualistic conception of human nature, consist of both mind or spirit and body. Well, we are in doubt which to prefer. The things of the mind, the things of the body. Often we go in one direction, then we swing to the other direction, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Okay? Born but to die. Notice the paradoxes throughout here. We are born but to die. And reasoning but to err. Yes, we have the capacity to reason, but we also have the capacity to make mistakes through reasoning. Alike in ignorance, his reason's such, whether he thinks too little or too much. Okay? Chaos of thought and passion, reason and passion. That we are a chaos of thought and passion. All confused, often pulling us in different directions at the same time. Still by himself abused or disabused, created half to rise and half to fall. Great Lord of all things, yet a prey to all. Great Lord of all things, and yet look how we are a prey not only to, animals if we were out in the wild, but also we're a prey to microbes, that can bring mighty human beings down low. Sole judge of truth, in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. The glory, the jest or joke, and the riddle, finally the riddle of the world. Okay? Because of all of the uncertainties and ambiguities about human nature. Okay, so once again, something that I've said here before, but let me just sum this part of it up, because this is going to provide a transition to Jonathan Swift, as I said, Pope's best friend. That reason, of course, this being the age of reason, is going to be very highly prized for what it can do. But at the same time, Pope wants to recognize limits to what reason may be capable of. And in the area of religion, which is what he's addressing here, he is saying that there are very definitely certain limits to what human reason is capable of validly doing or properly doing. Okay? Now, Pope also, as a neoclassical thinker and neoclassical artist, is going to be very interested in works of art that act out the kinds of principles of order that one claimed to find in nature, both human nature and external nature, and indeed even in nature taken as the cosmos as a whole. And if those are the principles that one finds in nature as a whole, then are those not the same kinds of principles that one should establish as foundational in one's art? In other words, that art should carry out the same kind of inspired ordering that one finds in nature. Okay? And if there is some sense in which the poet is inspired by the gods, if there is even some sense in which the poet has a divine spark in herself or himself, then would this not manifest itself in the very ordering of the work of art itself, the formal ordering? Now, what do we find in Pope? Notice he writes in rhyming couplets, doesn't he? Rhyming couplets. Just look at some of this. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic's side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride. Okay? Notice you could, if we wanted to, get down to that level of technicality, we could talk about how metrically these lines are manipulated according to certain principles of balance and order. But certainly just looking at the rhyme scheme, what we have are rhyming couplets throughout. Just as we did also, by the way, in Dryden and in Pope's Rape of the Lock. The rhyming couplet becomes one of the commonest forms in 18th century poetics. Why? Because the couplet provides always a kind of balance. Pope himself talked about this at some length, how you have the first line of the couplet, which is balanced by the second line of the couplet. Look at how that works here. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. And that's going to be answered by the proper study of mankind as man. See the opposition set up between the two parts of the couplet? Placed on this isthmus of a middle state. And then this is explained with the oxymorons, a being darkly wise and rudely great. Even paradox or oxymoron itself balances oppositions. Okay? Now, let's look, if we can go to the PowerPoint, let's look at some examples of the physical uses of these principles. And I'm going to just give you a few pictures here. Hetlu, which is a Dutch palace, basically a summer palace, was constructed in 1686, and this was right in the beginnings of what we call the neoclassical period, Enlightenment, Age of Reason. Okay? This is in Holland, but the Dutch and the English were very, very close in their cultures at this time. And look at the construction there. This is a photograph, by the way, that was done by a friend of mine, Diane Suddeth, who's also a professional photographer. And you'll notice, by the way, that I just recognize this is yours truly there in the foreground with my wife, who's also my cohort in researching and so forth. She also has a PhD in English. And notice the construction here, okay, in this design. What, is Scott trying to get my attention? Oh, okay. Notice the construction here. See the balance? You've got the central point, right, where the main door is, and see how the construction is done both to the right and to the left of that central point in order to provide balance, order, discipline, rationality. You have the same kinds of windows on either side. See how that's acted out in the first segment to the right. Look at the 6 windows on the main wall, and then look at the double window up toward the chimney, and then look at the first segment over on the left, and it's exactly the same, isn't it? The same thing is true with the outer segments on both the right and the left. And then look at the central part, and that's the Dutch flag, by the way, up above, in case you know, some of you are a little hazy about your flag recognition. And you'll notice the same principles of order there. Notice the use of column-like patterns, so these are not true columns, around the door itself. And then look how that motif is carried out right above the door with the first window above it and then the second window above it. And then notice the windows on either side of that central spot. This is a kind of architecture which is very different from much of the architecture that you find in the Middle Ages and even in much of Renaissance architecture. Here, neoclassical principles were being applied, and the same kinds of order which Pope is talking about as existing in the universe as a whole, in scale, both large and small, is what the artist here, the architect, should be carrying out in design. Now, let me show you something that is just as remarkable, maybe even more remarkable. This is also a photograph by my friend Diane Suddeth. This is the garden in the back. And this picture is taken from the upper level of the building that we just saw the front of. And notice how, looking down on the garden, you have the garden divided, first of all, into those 4 quadrants with a pool in the center. The 4 quadrants are almost identical until you look at the patterns inside each one, and there are certain variations of the patterns, but they are variations of patterns. And then notice, if you look into the distance, you're going to see a colonnade very much modeled on the kind of thing that you would find in Greco-Roman architecture. And once again, this is the neo-classical period. Notice that the garden design is bringing not only order to nature. This is not the promiscuous shoots of herbs and weeds and trees and foliage that he talked about earlier. This is nature methodized, that is to say, reduced to method, or human reason, from one point of view, is imposing a pattern and order on nature. From another point of view, human reason is discovering order in nature. Now, look at some of the parts of this. Looks like a carpet, doesn't it? You know, you've seen rugs like this, you know, in carpet shops and rug shops. You may have something like this in your own home. And those carpets themselves were based on principles of order and design. And by the way, these are mathematically very, very precise. Now, can you imagine the gardeners who did this? I mean, we usually think, oh, well, this is a palace. That's where the king and queen would be at least certain times of the year. Well, yeah, but the king and queen were not down there rooting around in the garden. You know, there were all of the gardeners. There's the master gardener who would design all of these, and master gardeners were artists and were highly prized artists. It was a very competitive kind of thing. And so then, of course, the master gardeners would have various subordinates down to the guys who were actually doing the digging and carrying, who would be carrying out these designs with an absolute mathematical precision. And see how these patterns vary, but even when they vary, they are still patterns, and you can recognize certain similarities from one quadrant of the garden to another quadrant of the garden. And then in this picture you can see better how the trees, which are all in pots, by the way, right? See the trees lining these 2 quadrants of the garden? Are all in pots, which of course requires very special gardening skill to deal with that. And then notice that not only are those hedges in the garden all very carefully sculpted and trimmed on a regular basis, but also look at the trees and how those are very carefully sculpted and shaped. That's a picture that I took, as well as that one there, which gets us just a little bit closer than my friend's picture did to that colonnade in the background, which is not quite semicircular, but almost semicircular, coming around, at least in part, the fountain in the back there. And then notice once again how there's a very orderly line of trees that separates the front part of the garden from the rear part of the garden. The colonnade itself consists of not only classical columns in a classical structure, but also those are placed with mathematical precision in relation one to another. So that if you look at any part of this system, notice that the part has meaning and makes sense only in relation to the whole. If you were to look at one of those columns, you would not really be seeing the function of that column, even aesthetically the function of that column, because that column exists in relation to the other columns in that system or order or pattern. See how that's symmetrical or parallel with the argument that Pope is making about nature and God's order in nature in the Essay on Man? Or, well, let's go back. I want to go back and just show you something else here. The same thing is true here. If you look at any part of the quadrant of the garden that is in the foreground, you won't see what's going on in the garden, will you, in this part of the garden? That everything exists in relation to everything else as part of a larger system or larger order or larger design. So this is neoclassicism. This is what the Romantics are going to be rebelling against, something that we'll only be able to touch on toward the very end of our class here, but is really where we begin the follow-up course to this, British Literature 2, in which we find nature being regarded as wild, and its very wildness is the sign of its divinity. It's being shot through with God and with the Spirit of God, which is unrestrainable and uncontainable. And people go out and seek nature in all of its wilder forms, not as with the stamp of man and of reason imposed on nature, but they go out like Wordsworth does. He goes out to Wales. He climbs Mount Snowdon, in the middle of the night, so he can have this glorious experience of arriving at the top of the mountain above the clouds, while it's still night, and then, of course, awaiting the glories of the dawn. People are going off to the Alps. I mean, the Alps up to that point were a nuisance. They were just a nuisance. It was hard to get around from one part of Europe to the other because you've got these mountains in the way. And now, of course, you have, among the Romantics, people celebrating the beauties of the mountains and of the ocean, especially the ocean in its wilder moods. You see, that's very different from what we've just been looking at, where we've been looking at the neoclassical appreciation for nature as ordered, designed, either through human reason improving on nature, bringing its art to nature, or the reverse, by human art uncovering or recovering the order that is already there in nature, and about which, of course, Pope has been spending a great deal of his time talking here. And that's why, as I said earlier on, Newton was regarded as having made fantastic advances in mathematics and in science. But even more, he was honored for making great advances in theology and in our understanding of the ordering of the cosmos itself. The Age of Reason. Okay.